family. And he created the angels, which is kind of an imprecise term, but it's one that we're all familiar with. They're created with free will just like us. And just like us, many of them have chosen to rebel against his authority, which is why you get all of the bad things happening in this world today. Why is the world of so much evil in it? 2 words, free will. God could eliminate evil today if he made us all just mindless automatons who could not do anything except fulfill our programming. And you get a lot of people, philosophers, who argue that free will is an illusion. We're all just the sum total of our biological programming. And that is a lie. We all have free will, and we will all be someday subject to being held to account for the choices that we've made. So, we're ready to go? All right. There are 3 main points to this talk. And again, these are sort of unadvertised bonus material to the talk, if you will, besides the gates of hell, which obviously was a key moment in Jesus' ministry because he declared his divinity in front of the gates of hell. But why did he do it there? I'm going to direct you to a text you may have heard of, but wouldn't have expected to be influential on New Testament theology, and that is the book of 1st Enoch. Heard of the book of 1st Enoch? Most of us who've heard of it think of it in connection to the explanation for what happened in Genesis chapter 6. The giants were on the earth in those days, and also after that, when or whenever, the Hebrew can mean, the sons of God went into the daughters of man. Of course, that's a euphemism. But the book of 1st Enoch actually has a lot more in it than that. And a lot of it is reflected in the New Testament. So we're going to talk about the book of 1st Enoch and why it deserves more respect than it gets from most Christians today. Secondly, a group that we've probably heard of, but assume that they all live together in this little desert compound on the shore of the Dead Sea called Qumran, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. Turns out there were Essenes all over ancient Judea, Israel, and that a group of them who lived up near the Sea of Galilee actually wrote a very important section of the book of 1st Enoch. And this relates to the third point, the geography of the ministry of Jesus. Why did he do what he did where he did it? Where he was baptized, where he declared his divinity, where he performed some of his most significant miracles. We sort of assume that because he was confronting the religious authorities in Jerusalem, that would have been the place where he focused his ministry, but it wasn't. It was a town called Capernaum, which really means town of Nahum, the prophet, Kfar Nahum. It's on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's about as far away from Jerusalem as you can get in ancient Judea and still be in Judea. Why was he there? We will talk about all of that because that region is, my wife and I believe, the southern end of what we think is the valley of the shadow of death. Believe that that is a literal place. Talk about that. And of course, at the north end of that valley is where you find the gates of hell. Quick propaganda plug. If you're interested in what Sharon and I do, you can find all of our stuff at our app. We have a free app for iOS, Android, Amazon, Kindle Fire. All of our video, audio content is there. We've been podcasting since 2005. And a lot of those archives are now available on this app. I mean, you can hear the audio quality. Cheap gaming headsets back in the day, held together with wire bubble gum. Some of our earliest interviews were conducted with a cordless phone and a doohickey, and I think that's the official engineering title for it, a doohickey from Radio Shack, which doesn't even exist anymore, connected by alligator clips to the cordless phone, run through a Sony Handycam and into our laptop. And that's where we did some of our first interviews with people like Mike Heiser, Tom Horn, Steve Quayle, and others. And all of that is here on this app. Now, the book of 1st Enoch, we think of it as one unified total, but it's actually divided into 5 sections that were written at different times. And then they were collated later, really in the Christian era, 1st and 2nd centuries AD. The Book of the Watchers is the first section. That's the one that most of us have heard of, chapters 1 through 36. This expands on the Genesis 6 narrative, that the angels saw that the daughters of man were fair and took wives of any they chose. And the giants, the Nephilim, were on the earth in those days. That was the first 36 chapter. The next section, 1 Enoch 37 to 71, called the Book of Parables, or the Similitudes of Enoch, if you want to get fancy. This is prophetic. And we're going to talk a lot about the Book of Parables here in just a little bit. The astronomical book, 1 Enoch chapters 72 through 82, Book of the Heavenly Luminaries. This deals with the Essene calendar. Our friend Josh Peck, friends Josh Peck and Ken Johnson, have written a lot about this recently. And they point to the year 2025 as being very significant, perhaps the beginning of the final 50-year Jubilee period. We'll find out. We live in exciting times, maybe more exciting than we'd planned on. The Book of Dreams, 1 Enoch chapters 83 through 90, and then the Epistle of Enoch chapters 91 through 108. Those are the 108 chapters, but they were not written in this order. Here's the actual order in which they were written. The Book of the Watchers is the oldest section, was completed by about the year 300 BC. The astronomical book, completed by about the year 200 BC. The Book of Dreams, written during the period of the Maccabees, 163 to about 142 BC. The Epistle of Enoch, sometime toward the end of the 2nd century BC. The Book of Parables, the prophetic section, was the last section completed. And scholars now believe, and this is new research within the last 10 or 15 years, a group of scholars who call themselves the Enoch Seminar get together to discuss the Book of Enoch and other Jewish religious writings from the Second Temple period. That's the period between the rebuilding of the temple in the 5th century BC, after Cyrus sent the Jews home, and then Artaxerxes said, okay, Nehemiah, go rebuild the wall, rebuild the temple, and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Romans. That's the Second Temple period. There were a number of Jewish religious writings, of which the book of 1 Enoch is the most important. And again, it was completed just about the time of the death of Herod the Great. In other words, just before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth and John the Baptist. And that is important, and we'll talk about that because it contains key teachings that show up in the New Testament. First of all, it talks about a coming judgment on the earth, an imminent judgment, where God would send an agent of judgment referred to as the chosen one or the anointed one, or another title that I will withhold for dramatic tension, who would come and deliver God's judgment on evil kings, wicked landowners, and rebellious angels. This is new. Where do we see in the Old Testament judgment on rebellious angels? Psalm 82, perhaps. Though you are gods, all of you, sons of the Most High, like men you shall die. Isaiah 26, perhaps. God will judge the kings of the earth and the host of heaven and heaven. But nothing explicit until you get to the book of parables in the book of 1 Enoch. This, by the way, was fundamentally in opposition to what was being taught by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. For Jewish religious scholars, the rabbis of the 1st century BC, the time just before and during the time of Jesus and the apostles, redemption only came by following the feasts, coming to the temple, deal with the money changers, buy your sacrifice, we'll perform the rituals and everything will be fine. Here you've got this group saying, no, God's going to send judgment imminently and judge the world. That was not an accepted Jewish religious belief in the 1st century AD. Also, forgiveness through repentance. This was not only in opposition to what was being taught by the rabbis in Jerusalem. There was a difference of opinion. There was a split, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, within the community of the Essenes, who, by the way, I should have pointed this out right up front. The Essenes are believed to be the authors of the book of 1 Enoch in its totality. But that section, the book of parables, is unique, and I'll tell you why here in just a bit. But the idea that you could be forgiven by repenting Okay, the priests in Jerusalem didn't buy that. The Essenes at Qumran, the ones we've heard about, they didn't believe that either. You've got to join our community. You've got to leave the world behind. You've got to follow all of our rules, and they had a lot of rules, if you want to be forgiven. Suddenly, the book of 1 Enoch has a new teaching that says otherwise. And then a title of a messianic character in the book of 1 Enoch. I mentioned the chosen one, the anointed one, and one that shows up more than 80 times in the New Testament, the Son of Man. The Son of Man. This expression is not found in any Jewish writing prior to the writing of the book of 1 Enoch, and specifically the writing of the book of parables, which was complete just before the birth of Jesus. Now, Daniel chapter 7 has a mention. In the apocalyptic vision, Daniel has a vision of the throne room of God. He sees the Ancient of Days, and at the right hand of the Ancient of Days is one like a Son of Man. Okay? That's also a phrase that you see in the book of Ezekiel on a regular basis. Ezekiel is visited by an angelic guide who says, Son of Man, come, witness this. Basically, in the Old Testament context, that phrase means human. So when Daniel's looking into heaven, he sees God the Father, the Ancient of Days, and one who looks like a human at his right hand, and to him a kingdom is given. But he doesn't do anything. He doesn't have any defined role. The book of 1 Enoch, the book of parables specifically, chapters 37 to 71, gives him a specific prophetic role. He comes to bring God's judgment to earth. This was new. Now, the Essenes who wrote this probably got the title or the idea of the title from Daniel 7, but the way it's used in 1 Enoch is unique. It is new, not found in any prior Jewish writing. And Jesus used this title of himself more than any other. In the New Testament, Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man 78 times. It's in the New Testament 83 times. All but 5 of them, Jesus is referring to himself as the Son of Man. And what's really interesting is that his followers knew exactly what he was talking about, even though it had only been in circulation for about 30 years by that time. So, this is why we pay attention to this stuff. People will sometimes ask Sharon and me, because we get into some of this weird stuff, dealing with the Nephilim and how the Canaanites venerated the spirits of the Rephaim. In Canaanite, that'd be Raphaima. They knew who the Rephaim were. Moses did not invent the Rephaim. Okay? Why are you dealing with that? Shouldn't we just focus on Jesus? Yes, exactly. And that's because Jesus paid attention to this stuff. That's why we pay attention to it. And as Mike Heiser used to say, if it's in the Bible and it's weird, it's probably important, yes. So the book of parables, written by the Essenes, but not at Qumran, not amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, this is the only section, chapters 37 to 71, the book of parables is the only section of 1 Enoch that has not been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everything else has been found there in 1 Enoch. The only complete manuscript of 1 Enoch is found amongst Ethiopian Bibles. The Ethiopian Bible still has 1 Enoch as part of its canon, as part of Scripture. There was a big debate in the early church, 1st and 2nd century. Should Enoch be in the Bible? Should it not be in the Bible? Eventually, guided by the Holy Spirit, they decided it shouldn't be. And I agree with that, actually. I agree with that. There are some inconsistencies and contradictions in 1 Enoch that you should not find in Scripture. And I'll talk about a major one in the book of parables. But the teachings that are in there show up in the New Testament. For example, John the Baptist, that is, his teachings, you remember reading about John the Baptist. He was out there in the wilderness preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Okay? The idea that you could be forgiven by repenting of your sins. Again, that was not a Jewish teaching. Even though when you look back in the Old Testament, then you can see verses like in Jeremiah, for example, where and in the Proverbs, where God values a contrite heart more than he values the ritual sacrifices. That's not what the rabbis, the Sanhedrin, was teaching in the first century AD. That was not approved Jewish doctrine in the first century. John was out there teaching something new, not only new from a Jewish perspective, but new from an Essene perspective. Again, the Essenes, generally speaking, believed you had to follow all of their rules. And they had ritual purity rules that were very strict. In fact, there's a community that's been found near the Sea of Galilee that they determined, and this is just within the last 10 years, that they determined had to be a community of Essenes because they had more ritual baths per dwelling than just about anywhere else in ancient Judea. They were very much believers that you had to be ritually pure, which involved washing. And so this community, which I'll show you a picture of it, it's like on the side of a cliff face. These guys were like really hardcore monks and stuff. But again, it was following the rules that got you forgiveness, not repenting of your sins. And here's John teaching this baptism of repentance for forgiveness. So that would have been right out as far as the Sanhedrin was concerned, and right out as far as the Essenes were concerned, especially at Qumran. Baptism of repentance. 1 Enoch chapter 50 is where you find it, where, and I'm quoting now, in those days, 1 Enoch 50, beginning of verse 1, there will be a change for the holy and the righteous ones. That would be the Essenes. They considered themselves the righteous and holy ones. And the light of day shall rest upon them, and glory and honor shall be given back to the holy ones. On the day of weariness he heaped evil upon the sinners, but the righteous ones shall be victorious in the name of the Lord of the spirits. That's God. He will cause the others to see this so that they may repent and forsake the deeds of their hands. There shall not be honor unto them in the name of the Lord of the spirits, but through his name they shall be saved. The others mentioned in this passage from 1 Enoch were those who were not members of the Essene community. They will see that God honors the righteous and the faithful, but because of that, they will repent, and then God will save them as well from the coming judgment on the earth. This was a radical change from what was being taught by Jewish religious leaders in the first century. It's only mentioned here in 1 Enoch, nowhere else in any prior Jewish writing. John the Baptist was preaching to the others. He was preaching outside the choir, as it were. This was radical. This was why the Jewish religious authorities in Jerusalem sent people to investigate. Why are you doing this? Why? What does this mean? Who gives you this authority? This is a radical departure from Jewish religious doctrine. And again, this teaching didn't appear until the end of the first century BC, just before the birth of John and Jesus. And scholars believe it was written here. This is a view from the Sea of Galilee towards a mountain, very distinctive, called Mount Arbel. In the foreground is the town of Magdala, where Mary Magdalene was from. You look at that mountain, Arbel. If you want to look up pictures of it on the internet, you can find them. There are a bunch of caves on the right-hand side. That's facing north. And that's where the Essenes lived. These guys literally climbed into their homes at night using rope ladders. That is hardcore. I'm not sure I would have that kind of religious fervor, shall we say. But they found mikvahs, those ritual baths, in that community, which is how they determined that's who was living there. And based on clues in the text, scholars who study this stuff for a living have determined that's where this section, the book of parables, chapters 37 to 71 of 1 Enoch, was written. Those guys who could look from there, they could see Capernaum, Jesus' hometown up here, where he based his ministry anyway. Bethsaida, where Peter, Andrew, and Philip were from over there. And off in the distance in the north, you could see Mount Hermon. And that's where they wrote this. Now, to understand the historical context that produced this book, we are now going to go through about 4 centuries of history in about 5 minutes. So buckle up, it's going to be a rough ride. Okay, 444 BC, Artaxerxes says, Nehemiah, go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the wall, rebuild the temple. Then, Alexander the Great comes and conquers the Levant, which is basically the area that includes Syria, Lebanon, and Judea, Israel. When the Jews returned from Babylon, by the way, in the 5th century BC, there were a group who believed that the time had come to build the temple that had been prophesied by Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapters 40 and 41, he prophesies the construction of this new temple. They wanted to build this new temple, but they found there was still a priesthood in Jerusalem. Like, no, the age of prophecy is over. We just need to keep doing the rituals. Celebrating the feasts, let us do our rituals, and everything will work out fine. So you basically had a split between a group called the Enochians. They hadn't written the book of 1st Enoch yet, but that's what they eventually settled on. And then this group of the Zadokite priesthood, the Zadokites. Zadok was the high priest in Jerusalem at the time of David. So in Jerusalem, you had the Zadokite priesthood, you had the Essenes, what became the Essenes, the Enochians, who were dissatisfied with what they found in Jerusalem, and many of them settled in the Upper Galilee, which is that region between the Sea of Galilee and Dan, Mount Hermon. Some of them settled as far away as Damascus, which is a lot closer than you realize. From Mount Hermon, it's about 40 miles. There are mountains on the Israeli side of the border, like Mount Bental, where on a clear day you can see Damascus. It's like, from where we live in the Ozarks to Springfield, Missouri. It's a small place. We got a friend who lives just north of the Dead Sea, said on a clear day, look to the northwest, you can see Jerusalem. To the northeast, you can see Amman, Jordan. That's how close, small this part of the world is. And yet the world's attention is focused on that, specifically the 37 acres called the Temple Mount. Anyway, many of these Enochians, again, living in the Upper Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, and as far away as Damascus. Then, Ptolemy II rebuilds the cult sanctuary at Dan, the golden calf there, remembering Jeroboam, who split the northern kingdom away from the son of Solomon, built the cult of the golden calf at Dan and at Bethel. I believe this was a worship of the father god of the Canaanites, El, whose nickname was Bull El, but that's a whole nother story. I go into that in detail in my book, Second Coming of Saturn. In the year 198 BC, the Seleucids, who were the kings of Syria, the Greek kings of Syria, came in and conquered Judea, and they immediately began a practice of Hellenization, basically forcing the Jews to conform to Greek ideas. Greek religion, Greek norms. You cannot circumcise your children anymore. You've got to do things our way. And that culminated in the Maccabean revolt, especially after Antiochus Epiphanes, who thought he was, Zeus incarnate, set up a statue of Zeus inside the temple on the Temple Mount and sacrificed a pig there to desecrate it. That led to the Maccabean revolt. The Jews became independent for a short time. The group, by the way, the Maccabees, which is a term in Hebrew that means hammer, Judah Maccabee, Judah the hammer, they were supported by a group called the Hasidians, which is from a Hebrew term that means the pious ones. The Hasidim is where we get the term Hasidic Jew today. It's not the same group, but it's what the word means, the pious ones. This then led to a leader from this group, the Hasidians, or the Essenes by this point, although again, still not known by that name, but a leader of this movement became, we think, the high priest in Jerusalem. He's known only as the teacher of righteousness because he had a falling out with Jonathan Maccabee in the year 152. The Jews have a list of high priests going back to the Babylonian period and beyond. They know who all of those high priests are. But for the years 159 to 152, not mentioned, because in the year 160 or thereabouts, the Greeks were fighting with one another. There were factions fighting for control of the Seleucid Empire, which is basically Syria, southern Turkey, western Mesopotamia. And a pretender to the throne named Alexander Ballas said to Jonathan Maccabee, hey, look, I need you to open up a southern front in my war against Demetrius, the king in Damascus. And if you do, I'll make you the high priest. Well, this teacher of righteousness said, you can't do that. You're not a Levite. You're not qualified to be the priest. Jonathan said, yeah, but I've got more swords than you do, so I think I will be the high priest. So there was a falling out, and the teacher of righteousness and his followers had to get out of Jerusalem, and they went and settled in Damascus. And that is why we believe this name was stricken from the record. Again, this is relatively new research by these scholars who are studying the book of Enoch and trying to come up with reasons to explain these things. Somewhat speculative, but it fits the evidence. In 152, the Essenes split from the Pharisees. The Pharisees actually were part of this group. And at one point, the Essenes were like, look, we cannot follow Jonathan Maccabee anymore because he's going to set himself up as the high priest. The Pharisees decided they liked access to the political power, and so they split, and that is where the Pharisees came from. The teacher of righteousness died in Damascus around the year 130 BC. There are some who study the Essenes who believe Damascus, in some of the Essene writings found at Qumran, was just a code word for the community at Qumran. Now, Qumran is east of Jerusalem. It's on the shore of the Dead Sea. There are the scholars whose work I think is compelling, convincing. Damascus actually means Damascus. They had to get away from the king in Jerusalem because he was angry that they weren't backing his play, and so they left. Sort of a 1st century, 2nd century BC Game of Thrones. While they were in Damascus, by the way, is where we get the name the Essenes. The word in Hebrew, again, is Hasidim, meaning the pious ones. In Aramaic, which is what would have been spoken in Damascus, that is Hasin, different plural ending, Hasin. The Greeks would have transliterated that as Essenoi, and that's where we get the word Essene. It comes from the Hebrew word meaning the pious ones. Essentially the same as calling the Hasidic Jews today Hasidic. Again, different groups entirely, but it's based on the same word. That's where it comes from. Around the year 100 BC, there was a split in the Essenes. The Qumran community was not founded until about this time, around 100 BC. The group who said, that's it, we're done with the world, we have to go live in the desert and separate ourselves from society entirely, they went south. They were the followers of the teacher of righteousness. There was another group that stayed in the upper Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, again near the town of Magdala specifically. Said, look, we've got our own rules, but we're still happy to go to town and do business and be part of the community. They were not like the ones at Qumran who basically cut themselves off from everybody. This was a split that took place around 100 BC. Now, around the year 80 BC, there was a crisis amongst the Essenes. They had been calculating that based on the prophecy in Daniel of the 77s, you're familiar with this? Where the angel comes to Daniel and said, 77s have been decreed for your people and your holy city, which 70 weeks of years, meaning 490 years. They were counting from the time Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BC. So they were figuring sometime around here, 80 BC, 90 BC, Messiah would come. They were looking for it. So by about the year 80 BC, when Messiah had not arrived, the chosen one, the anointed one, or whatever they were calling him prior to the writing of the book of parables, there was a crisis. We must have misunderstood. We must have figured it wrong. So we're going to say that it's going to be toward the end of the 1st century. It must be another 70 years ahead. We must have miscounted. So they were looking for Messiah imminently in the 1st century BC. The power of this prophecy is hard for us to get our heads around. We American Christians, by and large, according to survey after survey, don't assume we're going to see Jesus immediately. Interestingly, when you look at surveys that have been done of Muslims in the Middle East especially, the majority of Muslims in the Middle East, and in some countries it's upwards of 80%, they believe they will see their version of Messiah, the Mahdi, within their lifetimes. And that drives their actions. They do what they do because they believe Mahdi is just about here. The Essenes in the 1st century BC, both at Qumran and in the north, near the Sea of Galilee, were looking for their Savior to come immediately. While this was going on, there was a civil war that broke out in the year 67. There was a succession crisis where the Maccabean family were fighting with one another over who was going to rule. And because of that, the Romans got invited in. Pompey the Great. Come on in on my side, and I'll make sure that Judea is a friend of Rome. That's how the Romans got invited in. Now, that also led to other kingdoms coming in. The Parthians, basically the Persians, in the year 40 BC, invaded from the east and took over briefly. It was difficult being a border state or a buffer state in between competing kingdoms. And this has been the case with Israel all along. Egypt in the south, you had the powerful kingdoms, the Arameans in the north, and here you've got the Parthians to the east, the Romans to the west, fighting over the middle ground, and Judea in the 1st century BC was that middle ground. So the Parthians came in, they invaded, which led to Herod the Great, going to Rome and saying, hey, give me an army. And they did. So in 37 BC, Herod the Great came in with a Roman army at his back and kicked out the Parthians. And believe it or not, the Essenes, who'd been looking for a Messiah, thought Herod might be the one. I mean, knowing what we know about Herod today, he was kind of murdery. We laugh at this. But at the time, he saved, and the Essenes in the north, by the Sea of Galilee, actually backed him. Scholars have found that there was one season where he overwintered in that valley just next to Mount Arbel, where the Essene community was helping him. Who'd have thought? In fact, there was an Essene by the name of Menachem. Josephus wrote about this in the 1st century AD, who saw Herod as a young man, and he swatted him on the backside and said, this is so when you come into your kingdom, you will remember Menachem the Essene. And Herod laughed. He said, I'm not going to be a king. But he played his cards well, and he did. And so when he became king, Herod was actually very friendly to the Essenes. There is an Essene quarter and an Essene gate in Jerusalem because Herod was friendly to the Essenes. Yeah, Menachem, he prophesied he'd be king someday. Who knew? I mean, until I started digging into this about a year and a half ago, I thought the Essenes had all lived at Qumran and they didn't talk to anybody about anything. But no, turns out they were all over ancient Judea. Well, when it turned out that Herod was not the guy, they noticed he was doing very ungodly things like murdering family members and anybody who disagreed with him, amongst all of the wonderful building projects. That's when the book of parables came to be. The last quarter of the 1st century BC. We know Messiah's got to be coming. God would not forsake his promises. And suddenly you got this book or chapters that were later incorporated into the book of 1st Enoch that incorporate these teachings that are not found in any prior writing. And I'll talk about some more of these in just a moment. But this was the historical background. We're waiting for, and by the way, you see these dark spots here? Those are the caves on the front side of Mount Arbel, where these monks basically, although they could marry, they could have families, but they were living in those caves and produced this document that turns out actually is reflected in the New Testament. Now, again, the Upper Galilee and its spiritual significance. It's more than just that area around the Sea of Galilee. I mentioned Mount Hermon earlier. This is a picture of it from the Israeli side. Has snow on it until about this time of the year, September. which is really about the only time you can get to the summit because otherwise it's just too dangerous. You can die going up there. Why does it matter that the book of parables was written within eyesight of this? 30, 40 miles away at Mount Arbel, but you can see it on the northern horizon. This is the tallest mountain anywhere near Israel, 9,200 foot elevation, 3 times taller than the next tallest mountain anywhere in Israel. Why is this important? This was mentioned again as the location of the rebellion of those sons of God mentioned in Genesis chapter 6. The first section of the book of 1 Enoch, the book of the Watchers, says specifically that it was on the summit of Mount Hermon that these 200 watchers descended and made a mutual pact. Let's go take wives, let's have children, let's teach them all of this forbidden knowledge. I'm afraid, their leader said, whose name is Shemyaza, I'm afraid you're going to leave me taking the punishment for this sin. So they made a mutual pact on the summit of Mount Hermon, which, by the way, because of that, Hermon, which is the correct pronunciation, Hermon, derives from a Hebrew word, cherem, that means forbidden. I mean, as in ritually forbidden, as in touch this and you die. That same word shows up a lot in the book of Joshua, where you read about cities that were devoted to destruction. That's that word, cherem, devoted to destruction. Don't take anything from this city because it is forbidden. Take the gold and you'll die. It's all got to be destroyed because it is ritually impure. That is Mount Hermon. Pagans knew Mount Hermon was important. In fact, there is a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Sumerian king from the old Babylonian period, meaning about the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So 19th, 18th century BC, 1800 years before the birth of Jesus. This copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh describes Mount Hermon as the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. Heard of the Anunnaki, right? Contrary to what the guy with the big hair on the History Channel believes, these are not space travelers from planet Nibiru. These were the old gods of Mesopotamia who by the time of Abraham had been demoted to the netherworld. They were judges of the netherworld. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh and his buddy Enkidu were going there to defeat a monster called Humbaba, to make names for themselves so they would be famous and remembered forever. And after doing that, they went into the cedar forest, which was the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. Now bear in mind that Babylon was a 4-month walk from Mount Hermon back in the day. And yet they knew there was something about this mountain that was important and connected to the netherworld. It was also believed to be the abode of the creator god of the Canaanites, El, who I mentioned earlier, Bull El, where a mysterious inscription was found in 1869 by a fellow named Sir Charles Warren. Sharon found this as she was researching her series of novels, the Red Wing Saga. The first book in that historical series, where she's teaching spiritual warfare through fiction, begins with the Jack the Ripper murders. And she speculates, what if Jack the Ripper was never caught because he wasn't human? Well, it turns out that the guy who was leading the investigation in 1889 into the Ripper murders, Charles Warren, climbed to the summit of Mount Hermon, drew this map of the summit, and found this stone inside this temple. This temple is to this day the highest man-made place of worship on earth, 9,200 feet above sea level. There are lots of taller mountains on earth. Mount Hermon isn't even one of the 100 tallest. When you look at a list, it's not even in the top 100. But something about this mountain, this stone, reads in archaic Greek, which means it probably dates to after the 4th century BC when Alexander the Great conquered the area. Some scholars put it as late as the 2nd century AD. It reads, by order of the Most High and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here. Now remember I mentioned the 200 watchers who descended to the summit of Mount Hermon swore an oath with one another. We're all going to go through with this, right? So that if one of us gets caught, we all take the punishment. Scholars agree that this is a reference to that event. The Greeks knew about it. The Hebrews obviously knew about it because the book of 1 Enoch was a Jewish writing. Warren brought this down the mountain. This slab is 4 feet high, about 18 inches wide. It was 12 inches thick, weighed about 6,000 pounds. Somebody dragged it up the 9,000-foot mountain to put it into that temple. Interesting. He shaved it down to 4 inches thick to cut it down to 2,000 pounds. It's still cracked on the way down the mountain. It's now in the British Museum, except it's not on display. We looked when we went there in 2019. It's in the archives. Yeah, like at the end of Indiana Jones. It's in a warehouse somewhere. Top men are discussing it. But this was found in the summit of Mount Hermon. Again, the point being that this story was known and the religious significance of the mountain was known for literally millennia by the time of Jesus. By the way, this, make sure I don't trip on a cord here. This is a wall that Warren found, and the summit of Mount Hermon is scooped out to accept drink offerings, libations. You notice as you approach the summit, you have to circle it with the mountain on your left-hand side, meaning counterclockwise. In his report for the Palestine Exploration Fund in 1870, Warren speculated that the practice of the tawaf, which is the Muslim practice of circumambulating the Kaaba in Mecca counterclockwise, may have begun on the summit of Mount Hermon. That's an interesting concept. Yeah, well, that's for another day. Mount Hermon is at the north end of the ancient region of Bashan. Og of Bashan. Bashan was believed to be, in the ancient world, the literal entrance to the netherworld. Again, connected to the Anunnaki, judges of the netherworld, by the time of Abraham. There are remnants of the cult of the dead all over what was ancient Bashan. And we've been blessed with the opportunity to investigate some of these sites in person. And to have a friend with a high-def video drone, which is where we get this. This is Gilgal Rephaim. We spent a day at this site with the archaeologist who's done the most recent excavations here back in 2008, 9, and 10, Dr. Mike Freakman. This is us walking down here, by the way. That's Aaron's car down there. No, excuse me, there's his Toyota Land Cruiser there. Gives you an idea of the scale. It's about 500 feet across. It is estimated that there are between 45,000 and 60,000 tons of stone that were moved into position here. Dr. Freakman estimates about 400,000 work days, meaning one guy working an 8-hour day would take 400,000 days to put this together. Now, he estimates several years of construction, but contrary to the original estimates that put this in the Bronze Age, around 2500 BC, he did an analysis called optically stimulated luminescence, where he investigated undisturbed soil from the central core. And based on this method, which is, I don't understand, so I can't explain it, he came up with a date of construction of 3710 BC, give or take 180 years. So somewhere around 3700 BC. He also found that off in this corner here, which you can't see because it's been covered by grass, there was an older wall that was apparently dismantled and the stone reused to build this. Now, what is this for? There is a central core that you enter through a shaft, and it is essentially climbing into an artificial representation of the netherworld. In Dr. Freakman's opinion, it was used for a cult of the dead. It was for a shaman or a priest to enter and commune with the spirits of the dead. These radio lines, by the way, were not original to the construction. These were open. Later Bedouins put those in so they could keep their goats and sheep inside. But he believes that this whole site was used for ritual circumambulation, in other words, walking in a circle. He pointed out that one of his mentors, archaeologist named Josef Garfinkel, has written a book about artwork in the prehistoric world. 80% of the art in the prehistoric world, human figures shown dancing. And then he said, and do you know how they were dancing? I said, I have no clue. He said they were dancing in a circle. And we can tell because of the orientation of the figures on these, especially in the ancient Near East, which includes the area around Israel. It appears that they were always dancing counterclockwise because you always see left profile. So this practice of circling a sacred site counterclockwise, bearing in mind that this is only 25 miles from Mount Hermon, and on a clear day you can see the mountain, may have been practiced here as well. Now, just a quarter of a mile from this location is another site where, again, Dr. Freakman has been the most recent archaeologist to excavate. We have dubbed this the Serpent Mound of Bashan. You've heard of the Great Serpent Mound over in Ohio? This is 3 times longer, 4 times higher, and about 200 feet across. These are megalithic burials on the back. According to the Israel Antiquities Authority, there are 140 megalithic burials on the back of this ridge, and none in this area between Gilgal Rephaim and the ridge itself. Now, scholars say this was what they call a basalt flow, meaning a volcano on the horizon, which is now extinct, belched out some lava thousands of years ago, and it just happened to fall in this serpent-like shape. Doesn't change the fact that when you're on the back of this thing, you can see, boy, this sure looks like a snake. Let's bury all of our dead people up here and not any in the area next to it. Now, this is the point where I point out that Bashan in the ancient Hebrew language is a cognate, meaning same word, different language, from Ugaritic Bathan, which literally means serpent. In other words, Bashan is literally the place of the serpent. Our friend Doug Van Dorn, who was with us on this tour, was the first one to spot this on Google Earth. I mean, you can see this from space. Go to Google Earth, find Gilgal Rephaim, look a quarter of a mile north, and you will see this from space. I thought I was the first one to find it. I said, this is so obvious. Somebody's got, as I was putting together our tour video from 2018, so I looked on the internet. The only one I could find was our friend Doug, who put it in his book in 2013. So I can't claim to have discovered this, but Doug was with us on this. We got to go with Dr. Freakman, who explained what these things were. These, again, megalithic burials. And when they excavated some of these burials, these tombs, these piles of rocks, found that they were just small versions of Gilgal Rephaim, concentric rings of stone around a central chamber. It's just instead of 500 feet across, they're only 20 to 30 feet across. Why? Well, they didn't leave any instructions. Writing hadn't been invented yet, so we can only guess. That's us there on the back of this area. Now you can see this rectangular building here. This was a dwelling. Apparently, this was a sacred area. Maybe the priests who were responsible for overseeing the rituals at Gilgal Rephaim lived there. We don't know. What we do know is that he found, when he excavated, that those dwellings, at some point at the end of the Copper Age, what they call the Chalcolithic, again, using their timing, around 3100 BC, they ritually buried the dwellings. There were 3 of them that they found on the back of that serpent, and they buried them. They set the roofs on fire, they can tell because of the charring and of the artifacts that they found. Their utensils, like their grinding bowls, were made of basalt, which is volcanic rock. It's really, really hard. Once you make one of those, you don't just throw it away like you would like an old margarine container. Okay, this is useless, now we'll just toss it. No, but they broke them deliberately. They didn't want it desecrated. At the end of the Copper Age, beginning of the Bronze Age, they abandoned the site, broke their utensils, blocked up the entrances to the dwellings, set the roofs on fire, buried it all, and then left. And nobody knows why. But we see this elsewhere. Göbekli Tepe, which archaeologists call the world's oldest temple, dated to about 9,000, 8,500 BC, using their dates. Likewise, ritually buried to prevent it from being desecrated. This is just, again, mind-boggling. Why these tombs with the similar construction to Gilgal Rephaim, a chamber that you have to enter to get into a central core where it's completely pitch dark. Sensory deprivation tank, sort of. And especially if you were to couple this with a mind-altering substance of some kind, which they have found at some sites in ancient Israel. Early forms of beer, basically. And we know from Canaanite texts they had a ritual called the Marzia, where they would basically drink themselves stupid until they were seeing things. I mean, we joke about seeing, drunks seeing pink elephants and whatnot. They were trying to make that happen. Were they doing this here? We don't know. But I'll tell you, this is fascinating. What's really funny is Mike looks like a biker. He's an archaeologist, but he looks like a biker. He's got a handlebar mustache, bald head, shaved head. He's a Russian Jew, so he speaks with Russian accent. And we're telling him, hey, we read your paper. Oh, you know too much. Now I have to kill you. And we're not sure he was joking, and then he laughs. So that was a fascinating day. He's going to be over here speaking at a conference, archaeologist conference in Boston in November. Sadly, we're not going to be able to get there. But given what's going on in Israel, this archaeologist served 90 days with a unit of the IDF in Gaza. Yeah, that's what's going on in Israel. 10% of the country's been called up. What's really fascinating about these sites is that there are more of them on the Golan Heights. The Israelis don't even know this stuff is there. This is a site called Herbet Betaha. I had to ask Mike how to pronounce it because I'm clueless. This is on the bank of the Jordan River, 2 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. It's like a smaller version of Gilgal Rephaim. That's me in the blue shirt walking there. This is about 150 feet across compared to 500 feet across at Gilgal Rephaim. This is probably dated to about the same time, middle of the Copper Age, 3700 BC or thereabouts. But why was it there? Again, we don't know. If there was anything in the central core, long ago it was robbed out. Tomb raiders went in there and took anything that might have been of value to archaeologists. What's interesting is that like Gilgal Rephaim, where there are 2 gates, that when you're looking from the central core outward, it frames perfectly on a mountain on the horizon. This one does the same, except the gate is to the north. And Mike pointed out, Dr. Freakman, that in Sumerian, and we don't know what language these people spoke because, again, they didn't have writing, but in Sumerian, the word for mountain, Kur, K-U-R, is the same exact word they use for the netherworld, the connection between the world above and the world below. So why are they framing it on the mountain? Because that was a point of contact between the spirits above and the spirits below. Again, it's a hypothesis. It makes sense, but we won't know for sure until we discover that they actually did have writing and can decipher it, but that doesn't seem likely. Here's another shot showing the site. What's really interesting about this is that as you're looking at this, about a half a mile off to the northeast, well, from there would be the southeast, excuse me, that was the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip over there, Bethsaida. Half a mile away. Now, here's another site, another shot of this. And thanks to our friend Aaron Lipkin for this drone footage that he's allowed us to use. This is the Jordan River in the foreground. That's on top of a hill. The bank slopes down from the edge of the structure, probably 75 or 80 feet down here. This would make a great location for a bunch of people to sit, like a natural theater, and have somebody down there at the riverside teaching or perhaps baptizing. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. And I'll explain why Sharon and I, you can get a better sense of the height difference here. Explain why we think this is where Jesus got baptized. But more than that, we also think this is where the site described in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus led his followers into the wilderness near Bethsaida to feed the 5,000. Because at this location, Dr. Freakman, when he excavated there, doing his doctoral dissertation, kind of brave, because a lot of this stuff, when you start dealing with these megalithic sites, you get accused of fringe archaeology or pseudo-archaeology, like the guys, again, with the tall hair on the History Channel talking about, we don't know how it was done, so it must be aliens. And you get some Christians who say, well, we don't know how it was done, so it must be Nephilim. Okay, maybe, but I think the bigger question is why in an era before the invention of the wheel, before the invention of pottery to store your grain and stuff, why are you spending so much energy building these things? And at this site, Dr. Freakman found a couple of petroglyphs. You see the shape up there on top of the rock. Does that look like to you? Snake, maybe? Possibly. The next one is a little more clear. Both of these found near the central core of Khirbet Beteha. It's a fish. Now, why would you have an inscription of a fish at this site? We don't know how old it is, and Dr. Freakman is very honest about that. You can tell by the patina, the change in the covering, that this is newer than the rock. But when this was inscribed in the rock, we don't know. Impossible to find out. It could have been a Bedouin tribesman with his tribal marker there. Or it could be somebody commemorating some fish and some loaves of bread used to feed 5,000 people. Again, that area alongside Khirbet Beteha, that slope, you could fit a lot of people there. Having been there, having seen it, you get a lot of people sitting along on that slope, underneath that location. And then again, the river running by down here. Sea of Galilee, just 2 miles away. What's really interesting about these megalithic sites, there are more of them in Israel that are unknown practically to everybody. This one doesn't even have a name. It's just called Site 133. Dr. Freakman knew about it. He said, where is it? Well, it's in a training zone east of the town of Katzrin on the Golan Heights. Training zone? What do you mean? Well, the IDF trains there. We hope to go back there when we go back to Israel. Aaron Lipkin says he's got connections in the IDF. He'll see if he can get us into the site, hopefully when they're not training, and take a look at this, because again, this is the same sort of construction, concentric rings of stone around a central core. There's another one that doesn't have a name at all, and it's in the middle of a minefield that hasn't been cleared from the 1967 war, so nobody goes there. But the other type of megalithic structure that you see on the Golan Heights everywhere is called a dolmen. Dolmen is a word from Brittonic, which is a Celtic language. It means table, and you can see why. These things look like tables. There are estimated to be 25,000 of them in the Jordan River Valley, more than 5,000 of them on the Golan Heights, ancient Bashan. Now, dolmens are found all over the world. They're in Korea, they're in the Caucasus Mountains. Reportedly, Steve Quayle says there are some in Montana. That would be fantastic. Love to go see them. What do these represent? Kind of looks like, I don't know, portal, doorway. A liminal boundary, which is a term that scholars use, something that delineates the boundary between this world and the next. Why are there so many in the Jordan Valley, and why are there more than 5,000 on the Golan Heights? You want to look at a map here. The red dots indicate the locations of dolmen fields on the Golan Heights. There's Gilgal Rephaim there. Here's Gadara, where Jesus cured, Legion, for we are many, the Gerasene demoniac. Ashtaroth, where they fought against Og of Bashan. Bashan actually includes a big chunk of Syria. The reason we're not red dots over here is because the Israeli archaeologist can't go there. But the red dot, in fact, there's an Israeli archaeologist named Moshe Hartal who was responsible for a survey of all of these things on the Golan Heights, and he said, we can no longer use the term dolmen field anymore, meaning an area where you find a bunch of them together, because we can't tell where one of them ends and the next one begins. For all intents and purposes, the whole Golan Heights, ancient Bashan, is a giant dolmen field. But notice, Kerbet Bateha right there, big cluster of them right there. Another megalithic site called Jethro's Cairn up here that looks like a giant crescent moon, sadly not part of this presentation, but these things are all over the place. We visited one at Shamir at the north end of the Jordan Valley between Mount Hermon, which is up there at the top right, the top center, and the Sea of Galilee. There's a kibbutz named Shamir, and they found just within the last 10 years an inscription, or inscriptions plural, on the underside of the capstone of this dolmen. This dolmen is the big daddy of dolmens in Israel. You can see Mount Hermon in the distance there. That capstone is estimated to weigh 50 tons. 50 tons, that's like two 18-wheelers on the highway, fully loaded 18-wheelers. And somehow they levered that top stone up on top of the ones there. This doesn't give you a sense of the scale. This is me standing next to it last spring. Trying to look like I know what I was talking about. But to give you an idea of how big it is in the inside, this is Doug Van Dorn and me discussing the inscriptions on the underside with Sharon in there taking the video. And we were hoping, it's like, well, okay, this has probably been here for, 4,000 years. It's probably fine. Let's hope there's no earthquake while we're in here, because I'm pretty sure 50 tons would win. But the point is that archaeologists who've been exploring these and investigating these dolmens believe that cluster of dolmens outside the Shamir kibbutz, and when we go back to Israel, we found this, you can get to this with the tour bus, so we're going to take the tour here. This was the center of the dolmen building culture that surrounded the Jordan River Valley. They found 1,100 of these dolmens on the hills on either side of the Jordan Valley. Again, that's the valley that the Jordan runs through between Mount Hermon and the Sea of Galilee. And this, they believe, was the center of the dolmen building culture, and it itself was, again, the biggest dolmen in that field. This is the valley, which is now, it looks almost like the American Midwest, well, with the exception of the hills. I've been to Turtle Mountain in North Dakota, and I know that compared to most other places in the world, it's a mountain in name only. But my mom is from North Dakota. She was very proud of it. So, and it is a cool site to visit. Anyway, but this is what the Jordan Valley looks like today. 2,000 years ago, this was a swamp. It was called the Hula Swamp, and there was a lake there, Lake Hula. The Israelis drained it in the 1950s to get rid of malaria, but also freed up a lot of farmland. But there was something about that valley. It's mentioned in Amorite texts from the ancient kingdom of Ugarit as a place where their god, the king of their gods, Baal, or Baal for you scholars, was confronted by the death god Mot and was temporarily killed. He didn't stay dead, anyway. But this area, again, was known to the pagans around ancient Israel to be supernaturally charged. There was something supernatural about it and connected to the netherworld. So again, this region, the ancient kingdom of Bashan, Mount Hermon at the north end, that valley, that's that little lake there I mentioned, Lake Hula, which was drained by the Israelis. Now that area there all farmland. But that valley that it runs through, surrounded on both sides by more than 1,000 dolmens. There's a reference to Bashan, many references to Bashan in the Bible, and every time you see a reference to Bashan, you have to keep that in mind. The understanding that something about that region was connected to the netherworld, supernaturally connected. Psalm 22, verses 12 and 13, which is a messianic prophecy, a prophecy of Jesus on the cross. Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. This is the psalm, Psalm 22, that begins with a verse that Jesus quoted from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? He wasn't saying, God, I know you've abandoned me. He was pointing back to this psalm and the mention of Bashan. Now, most Bible commentators looking at this and the references to, there's also a reference in Amos to the fat cows of Bashan. Ezekiel 39, a reference to goats and sheep that will be slaughtered after the battle of Gog and Magog, all of them fat beasts of Bashan. Most Bible commentators will say it's because Bashan was well known in the ancient world as a region famous for its livestock. A scholar by the name of Robert Miller, who teaches at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C., wrote a paper on this several years ago called The Bales of Bashan. And he pointed out, using agronomy and archaeology and soil samples, he pointed out that you cannot grow enough fodder to raise cattle in Bashan. You can raise sheep, you can raise goats, they don't eat as much as cattle do. But try to raise cattle in Bashan, you go broke. It was a terrible place to raise cattle. He said, no, literally, and I'm quoting now, Iron Age Bashan would have been a terrible land for grazing and the last place to be famous for beef or dairy cattle. In other words, he said these were not the Bales of Bashan, the bulls of Bashan were not bovine, they were divine. His words, not mine. I wish I'd thought of it. Anyway, why does any of this matter to us? Why do we care what the ancient pagans believed in Mesopotamia about this region and its connection to the netherworld? Because it's where Jesus based his ministry. It's where Jesus got baptized. It's where Jesus declared his divinity. I'll show you that right now. John the Baptist, John chapter 1. Beginning at verse 26, John answered them. These were the religious scholars sent by the Pharisees in Jerusalem. They sent agents to find out, what is this baptism repentance that you're talking about? John answered them, I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie. These things took place in Bethany across the Jordan where John was baptizing. The next day, he saw Jesus coming toward him and said, Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Now, Bethany across the Jordan has been a mystery that has puzzled Christians for 2,000 years. Where is Bethany across the Jordan? We want to build a tourist place there so that we can all be baptized where Jesus got baptized. In fact, the king of Jordan just announced a couple of years ago they're going to spend $30 million to set up a tourist site at the traditional location, which has been certified by UNESCO, so it must be true. I don't have a high opinion of the United Nations. This is down near Jericho. It's on the east side of the Jordan River across from Jericho. That is the traditionally accepted place, Bethany across the Jordan. In the 3rd century AD, a Christian theologian from Alexandria, Egypt, Origen, went to Judea and tried to find the location, and he could not find it. Nobody had ever heard of Bethany across the Jordan because the only Bethany mentioned in the Bible is the one on the Mount of Olives. Now, across the Jordan, again, means east of the Jordan River. There is no Bethany east of the Jordan River. So Origen, writing 200 years later, wrote that even though the best and earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John, the Greek manuscripts, the oldest and best manuscripts mention Bethania. That must be wrong because nobody knows where it is. So Origen changed it to Beth Abara, or Beth Abara, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. That's still how the King James translates it to this day, by the way. Beth Abara, meaning house of the crossing. And he put it near Jericho. And that is where the United Nations says it is, where the King of Jordan says it is. But like Salah said to Indiana Jones, they're digging in the wrong place. Why? A friend of Sir Charles Warren, who I mentioned earlier, the one who found that stone on the summit of Mount Hermon, a fellow by the name of Lieutenant Claude Condor, writing in the 1870s, went looking for it. The Palestine Exploration Fund, archaeologists, but they also reported back to the Foreign Office in the UK because they knew the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. And so they wanted to know what was in the Holy Land, what we could get our hands on. So the archaeologists were there doing some great archaeology. Some of these guys, their works is still cited by archaeologists today, but they were also spying. So anyway, but Condor thought there was a place south of the Sea of Galilee near the town of Beth Shan that was Beth Abara. But then a few years later, he rethought that. And he said, no, Bethania is the oldest Greek text. So that word, that name has got to be correct. We got to throw out Beth Abara that Origen invented in the 3rd century. Bethania has got to be the Greek form of a name well known from the Romans during the Roman period, the Latin name Botania, which is Bashan. Bashan across the Jordan. And look at all them dolmens over there. That's what those little pi symbols mean. Dolmen fields. Bashan across the Jordan. This right here is about where we were at Khirbet Betaha. Now, why do I think that's the place? Because Jesus called his first 3 disciples from Bethsaida. John was being discipled by, or he was discipling, I should say, Andrew. We read in John chapter 1, beginning at verse 35, how after he sees Jesus and says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And then he says, "I saw the Spirit of God descend on Jesus like a dove." When did that happen? When Jesus got baptized. John doesn't mention it in his gospel, but we know that from the other 3 gospels. Jesus comes out of the Jordan River, the Holy Spirit descends on him like a dove. And then the next day, according to the Gospel of John, the next day, John sees Jesus again and says, "Behold the Lamb of God." Andrew runs home to tell his brother. Now, again, Bethsaida is here. It's half a mile from there, which is the Jordan River, overlooking the Jordan River. Now, do we know for sure that that was the place? No, we don't. Speculation, just based on the topography of the land and the fact that between Khirbet Betaha, that megalithic structure, and the river, you've got a natural theater. A place for a lot of people to sit and listen to a teacher and perhaps line up to be dunked in the River Jordan. But here's the thing. This location, although it's only half a mile from there and the Jordan River, it's about 90 miles away from the site being developed by the country of Jordan as the official baptismal site. Now we know from the other Gospels that Andrew and his brother Peter, whom he ran home to get, were in a fishing business. They were partners with James and John. Where was their boat? On the Sea of Galilee. 90 miles from the baptismal site in Jordan. Now we got friends, credentialed archaeologists, who accept the Jordan location as the official site. I don't have the credentials, but I've got pretty good reading comprehension. And common sense says 90 miles, which is a 4 or 5 day walk, is not a place you want to be following a teacher if you've got to be up in the morning to go fishing on the Sea of Galilee. And especially when your next disciple, Philip, also comes from Bethsaida. The first 3 disciples called, Philip, Andrew, Peter, from this town here, half a mile from that site there, overlooking the Jordan River. We think that's as good a candidate as any for the official baptismal site. It's not a place where anybody goes to get baptized. The site where we've been a few times, Yardenit, which is also on the south side of the sea, Christians go in there know, okay, this isn't the site, but it's the Jordan River, so it's good enough. But we think that's the location there, the south end of that valley. Just to give you an idea, the area where Jesus based his ministry. Mount Arbel, that mountain where the Essenes wrote the book of parables, just above the town of Magdala. Jesus based his ministry there. Capernaum, Bethsaida here, north end of that valley, Caesarea Philippi. And then, of course, Mount Hermon. Caesarea Philippi is basically at the foot of the mountain. And I should point out that from Mount Arbel, Nazareth is about a one-day walk. Was Jesus in a scene? No, I don't think so. But, I mean, he's God, so he knew what they'd written.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Does the United Nations, they have what do you want to call it, a station up there?
United Nations has a post on the summit of Mount Hermon. They call it Camp Hermon. It's there allegedly to keep an eye on things in Lebanon and in Syria and in Israel so they don't violate the peace treaties. While we were in Israel last spring, we, as part of our little investigation when we went to Gilgal, Rephaim, and other sites, we visited a place called the Ayun Stream Nature Reserve. The Ayun Stream descends from Lebanon into Israel, and it's one of the sources of the Jordan River. There's a waterfall. I can't quite reach up there, but it's a little south and west of Caesarea Philippi, where it descends into that valley, the Hula Valley, which the Jordan runs through between the Sea of Galilee and Mount Hermon. And that, according to scholars, is where, if you've read the book of 1st Enoch, Enoch delivers God's reply to a petition written by these watchers. They sent God a note through Enoch saying, please don't punish us. We're sorry we got caught. And yeah, I'm sorry I got caught with my hand in the cookie jar. Please don't punish us. And God sends Enoch to them at a place called Avel Main. In the translation, it looks like Abel Main, A-B-E-L-M-A-I-N. Hebrew would be Avel Maim, meaning waters of weeping. We had to go through a little town called Metula to get there. Metula is the northernmost village in Israel. It's surrounded on three sides. It's like a little thumb that sticks up in Lebanon. It's surrounded on three sides by Lebanon. And as we were driving through Metula, our tour guide, Yeshai, IDF veteran, like most adult men, wicked sense of humor. You see that white van over there? Yeah? Hezbollah. Like, what? And we looked closer and said, no, UN on the side. But that begs the question, since Hezbollah has launched 6,000 rockets into Israel since last October, what is the United Nations doing there? What are they doing there?
Watching.
Yeah, watching and watching. And that's what they're doing on the summit of Mount Hermon. They're just watching. So, Capernaum. Jesus moved here after the arrest of John the Baptist from Nazareth. And according to Matthew, it was to fulfill prophecy. Now get this. Matthew chapter 4, beginning at verse 12. Now when he heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet in Isaiah might be fulfilled. The way of the sea beyond the Jordan, again, beyond the Jordan, east of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Money quote. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. Matthew was quoting from Isaiah chapter 9. That is the prophecy of the coming Messiah that includes the famous phrases, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Matthew said that Jesus moving from Nazareth to Capernaum meant that a light had dawned on people living in the region and shadow of death. The way of the sea, we know where that is. That was the Roman road, the Via Maris, that ran from Egypt to Damascus. It came up to the Sea of Galilee here at Tiberias, went up to the town of Hatzor, and then crossed over on its way to Damascus. This is the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. Now, let's overlay the highest concentration of those dolmens, those megalithic structures for the cult of the dead. Well, it's right there. Here's another thought. Where did Paul have his Damascus Road experience? In there, maybe? The region devoted to the cult of the dead, the region that everyone in the ancient world knew was the entrance to the netherworld, the entrance to the Canaanite hell. It was at Mount Hermon, the base of Mount Hermon, Caesarea Philippi, just a little east of the city of Dan, where Jesus declared his divinity. He essentially said to the spirit realm, it's on. Caesarea Philippi, which is known as the Grotto of Pan, this big cave here. This is Sharon and me last spring standing out in front of the cave. Maybe standing in front of a cave known as the gates of hell with big smiles on our faces wasn't really appropriate, but, we were happy to be there because of what took place there. This is where Jesus said in Matthew 16, "Who do you say that I am?" After first asking him this question, who do people say the Son of Man is? And some said, well, it's Elijah, or maybe it's Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. They didn't say, Son of Man? What do you mean, the Son of Man? They knew what he was talking about, even though the phrase had only been used as a title for the first time in the book of parables, which wasn't completed until about the time Jesus was born, 30 years earlier. And yet it had been circulated widely enough that his disciples and whoever else was there knew what he was talking about. Who do people say the Son of Man is? And then he said, who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. In other words, God confirmed it to Peter. And I tell you, you are Peter, Jesus entering into some wordplay here. You are Petros. And on this rock, this Petra, this 9,200-foot mountain that we're standing in front of, I will build my ecclesia, my congregation, my church. And the gates of hell, this big cave right here, will not prevail against it. In the 1st century AD, Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote that no one had ever been able to lower a plumb line into the water in this cave that was long enough to hit bottom. They literally believed that this was the entrance to the netherworld. And Jesus walked his disciples there from Capernaum. That is a 30-mile hike. That is a 14-hour walk in that terrain. You don't make a 14-hour hike unless it's really important. In fact, when you look at the sequence of events in Jesus' life, he had gone to the region of Tyre in Lebanon and Sidon prior to this. And the road from Tyre that leads back to the Sea of Galilee comes right past here before cutting south and following that valley. He could have said, hey, look, as long as we're in the neighborhood, let's just stop over here. I got something important to tell you. No, he went back to the Sea of Galilee first, to Capernaum, where he fed the 5,000, perhaps where we think. Cast demons out of the Gerasene demoniac. We are legion, for we are many. And then he walked them back here to a pagan cult center with a temple to Zeus, or Jupiter in the Roman period, temple to the emperor. There was an Asclepion there, which was a healing center where you took a soporific, some sort of a drug, and then you fell asleep and let snakes crawl over you, and whatever weird nightmares you had, you'd tell the priest, and they would tell you how to cure yourself. His disciples had to be like, Rabbi, why are you bringing us to a pagan site? so Jesus could declare his divinity there. Yes, I am the Son of Man, which, as defined by the book of 1 Enoch, was the one who was going to come and pass judgment, execute God's judgment on the sinful angels, on wicked kings, and evil people all over the world. They knew what he was talking about, and he did it right there. And then, according to Matthew 17, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. What's the only high mountain near Caesarea Philippi? Mount Hermon. 3 times higher. There are a lot of people who still believe Mount Tabor in Israel is the mountain of the Transfiguration. I'm sorry, but this one is the very high mountain, the high mountain that Jesus led them up, because he was making a point in the spirit realm. He was transfigured into a being of light. He was essentially sending a flare into the spirit realm and saying, okay, now you know. Here I am, come get some. And then from here, when he came down, he cast demons out of a possessed boy. He sent the 70 or 72, depending on your translation, out into Galilee ahead of him to cast out demons. That's a spiritually significant number. The number in the ancient world, 70 or 72, was a symbol. It meant all of them. According to the Canaanites, this mountain, which was like their version of Mount Olympus, was where their chief god El ruled with his wife Asherah and their 70 sons, the gods of all the nations. Jesus comes down the mountain, sends out 70 disciples, saying basically, my 70 are stronger than your 70. And then he went to Jerusalem to fulfill his mission. He basically poked the fallen realm in the eye and said, come on. And they sent him to the cross. And as Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 2, if they understood what was going on, the rulers of the age, the archons, he's not talking about politicians, he's talking about supernatural rulers, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. They didn't understand. They were sending him to fulfill his mission, which he basically prodded them into doing by declaring his divinity to his followers at the base of Mount Hermon and then climbing the mountain and doing it on the summit of Mount Hermon. While he was in Jerusalem, he spent the last week of his life dividing his time between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount teaching. It was there when he gave at the Mount of Olives the longest teaching he did on what would come in the end of days. And it's where he said, for as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. Likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot, this is from the Gospel of Luke, so will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. A title from the book of 1 Enoch that did not exist in any prior Jewish writing, and written in that area near the Sea of Galilee that we believe was the valley of the shadow of death, where Jesus based his ministry so that that prophecy in Isaiah would be fulfilled. Now look, there are reasons that 1 Enoch is not in the Bible. In chapter 71 of the book of Parables, which is the last chapter of that book, that section of 1 Enoch, Enoch is told that all of these prophecies about the coming Son of Man are about him. Enoch is the Son of Man. It's like, wait a minute. Does that mean Jesus was misinformed? No, I don't think so. Scholars who study this believe that that was written later, toward the end of the 1st century AD, and inserted into the book of Parables, because Jews who didn't like the fact that Christians were saying, yes, we know who the Son of Man is. It's Jesus of Nazareth. And like Peter said on the day of Pentecost, you guys killed him. And so Jews are like, no, it can't be him. It's Enoch. Which means Enoch apparently went back in time and appeared to himself, and no, this doesn't make any sense. So again, there are reasons that the book of 1 Enoch is not in the Bible. That is a contradiction, and Scripture does not contradict itself. But the book was held in high regard by the early Christian church. In fact, scholar James Vanderkam wrote, "It is undeniable that some early Christian authors accorded high, indeed scriptural, standing to the writings of Enoch." For example, Paul, in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 10, "A wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels." You've heard that verse, right? It's kind of weird. It's like, what? Women should have their head covered because of the angels? What does that mean? We don't get any explanation of that in the Old Testament. But we do read about the angels who saw that the daughters of men were fair and how they were, some early church fathers interpreted as enticed into commingling with human women. That's in the book of 1 Enoch. Jude verses 14 and 15 directly quotes from 1 Enoch chapter 1 verse 9. God appears with 10,000s of his holy ones. That's taken directly from 1 Enoch. 1 and 2 Peter. Peter makes reference to things that come directly out of the book of 1 Enoch. For example, when Jesus descends in 1 Peter 3, beginning at verse 19, if I remember right, maybe verse 18, where he descends after he's crucified, and he proclaims to the spirits in prison. The word translated spirits, the Greek word, does not refer to human spirits in the Bible when it's used. It refers to other spirits. Well, who are the spirits in prison that he's talking about? The ones who sinned in the days of Noah. Okay, where is that in the Old Testament? It's not explicit in the Old Testament, but it is in 1 Enoch. Clearly Peter knew 1 Enoch. And a reference in 2 Peter 2 verse 4, God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them down to hell, but the Greek word is Tartarosis. He cast them down to Tartarus, not Hades. Again, where do we see angels in chains in gloomy darkness, which is also referenced by Jude? Not in the Old Testament, but you see it in the book of 1 Enoch. He's taken on a tour of the underworld, and he sees mountains burning with flame in the netherworld. These are the angels who sinned. So again, it was given high status in the early church. But, in fact, even John, who wrote the book of Revelation, according to scholars Lawrence Stuckerbrook and Mark Matthews, they wrote this in 2012. "It is likely that the writer of Revelation," being scholars are very careful, they don't say, well, it was John, but anyway, we believe it was John the Apostle, "either was directly acquainted through literary or oral transmission with several of the major sections of 1 Enoch, or at least had access to traditions that were influenced by these writings." Some of the things that we see in the book of Revelation, written by the Essenes in the 1st century BC. And of course, Jesus himself and his use of the title, the Son of Man. So not only does 1 Enoch include important information about the sin of the angels, which necessitated God's direct intervention to fix the world, the book of parables, apparently delivered through divine revelation, dare we say, to the Essenes who lived near the Sea of Galilee in the 1st century BC at exactly the right time in history, just before the birth of John the Baptizer and Jesus of Nazareth, just before the arrival of the Son of Man. And here's the thing, when Jesus used the phrase, or David wrote it in the Psalm, the valley of the shadow of death, Jesus has literally experienced that valley. I mean, it's the valley that he walked his disciples through 14 hours each way to get to Caesarea Philippi and back, where he declared his divinity. He's been there, and he knows when we're experiencing that, to use a phrase, the dark night of the soul. My children have gone astray. I'm so lonely. Jesus has been there in that valley, spiritually, but also literally. That marshland surrounded by these megalithic structures, these monuments to the cult of the dead. He has been through it and declared his divinity and his superiority, his victory over the spirit realm in that valley. Sharon has done some teachings on the 23rd Psalm. In fact, she's getting ready to start a podcast next month. She's going to call The Armored Sheep. She's done up a really cute little logo for it of his sheep dressed like a Roman legionnaire, you know. Breastplate of righteousness, holding his little sword. He's got his shield, helmet of salvation on. But the thing to remember is that when we're going through that valley, the shepherd is always there with us. When the enemy is staring you in the eye, saying, "What do you got, human?" Just say, "Hey, look, talk to the shepherd, because he's right here. And he's got a rod and a staff, and he's ready to administer a cosmic beatdown." And then, remember this from the 23rd Psalm, and this I think is so cool. She talked about this at a presentation once, and 300 people just went, "Ah," all at once. You remember the 23rd Psalm? He prepares a table before us in the presence of our enemies. This battle is more literal than we've been taught. Jesus pointed to it through where he based his ministry, where he was baptized, where he declared his divinity, and where he provoked the spirit realm into sending him to fulfill his mission. The valley of the shadow of death, the gates of hell, they are real, but he's been there, and he's with us to the end of the age. Praise God, and thank you. This is, again, a little more propaganda. This is our next book, which is coming out next month. In fact, the Audible got released early, so the Audible version, if you're into audiobooks, is already out there. So, but this book will be out next month. And I think we're going to do specials on it at Skywatch TV, but probably not until January. So if you got any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer some for you. Yes, sir?
Tomorrow, your presentation is the secret history of Israel.
Yes.
Can you give us kind of an idea what that's going to be about?
Yes, the secret history of Israel. There's been a lot of pushback on Israel and on our Jewish brothers and sisters since the war that began last October. And I understand, if we see the way Gaza has been depicted and the horrific devastation that's been worked in Gaza, it's easy to understand why people would be upset with Israel's response. There are some who call themselves Christians, and professing Christians, let me put it that way, who argue that Israel is not the legitimate Israel, that we should not support this Israel because it's not the fulfillment of prophecy. God promised to bring his people back to the land multiple times in the Old Testament. And yet there are those who believe that what the nation that declared independence on May 14th, 1948 is not the legitimate Israel, that it was a creation of the Rothschild banking dynasty, secret societies, the Illuminati, Freemasons, whatever, that they're not righteous, they're following Kabbalah, they're following the Talmud, and yes, the Talmud has some very disturbing and evil things to say about the nature of Jesus. The fact is, Israel's founding has a lot of hidden details, and they are hidden from history because the men involved want to keep them that way because they're highly embarrassing. The Rothschilds had little to nothing to do with the founding of modern Israel. The powers that be in the Western world, especially the United Kingdom and the United States, actually tried very hard to prevent Israel from coming into being and worked very hard in the years after 1948 to aid and abet Israel's enemies. I think a lot of us are open to the idea, understand that there were powerful men here in the US and the UK who profited in the 1930s by siding with the government of Germany in the 1930s. That was true. And those people were very keen to keep their involvement with Hitler's Germany a secret in the years after the war. But there was a book written around 1994, published in 1994. A lot of the information comes from that, called The Secret War Against the Jews. It's an investigative work by a former Department of Justice prosecutor named John Loftus and an investigative journalist from Australia named Mark Ahrens. The Secret War Against the Jews goes into great detail about how some of these men tried very hard to keep Israel from coming into being, and the secret deals that were made behind the scenes by David Ben-Gurion to secure Israel's future. In a nutshell, Ben-Gurion had to blackmail Joseph Stalin and powerful men in the United States to get the votes Israel needed in the UN in 1947 for the UN to vote for the creation of an independent Jewish state. And then there were things that had to happen in 1967 and 1973, and 1948 actually, that prevented Israel from being overrun by its enemies. And again, a lot of these details have been kept out of the news and official histories because it would be highly embarrassing to those whose names are involved. So I think you'll be surprised, especially, well, I think you'll be surprised. The book was a New York Times bestseller back in the 90s, but it kind of dropped off the radar because it's inconvenient and embarrassing. Like one of the guys whose names I'll mention prominently tomorrow has an airport named after him at Washington, D.C. It's not Reagan. It's the other airport. Intelligence veterans who were interviewed by Ahrens and Loftus basically called this guy a traitor. There was a deep state at work, not just in the US, but in the UK, and they were not interested in an independent Jewish state. So in a nutshell, after 1930 and oil was discovered in Arabia, where are you going to make your money? Siding with the Arabs or siding with the Jews? Yeah, it's interesting. And the role of another fellow who's, I only knew from the aftermath of the Reagan shooting, Alexander Haig, where he said, you know, I'm in control in the White House. His role in 1973 is basically unknown, but he basically single-handedly saved Israel. And I'll explain how tomorrow. Yes, sir. Alexander Haig.
In 73?
In 73.
That was Nixon.
The Yom Kippur War, right.
Nixon.
It was Nixon, and it was, Nixon was president, but he was already embroiled in the Watergate scandal. Alexander Haig was operating without the knowledge or the approval of Nixon or Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State. They wanted to teach those uppity Israelis a lesson and let them get their nose bloodied. They almost got them destroyed. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just want to, we talked earlier there, but
Yeah.
We've been following you and Sharon for years and years, and I just wanted to say that a lot of stuff that, you know, you guys taught us a long time ago, you were really instrumental in waking us up, so I'm just putting in a plug for you, okay? And 5 and 10.
You're too kind.
Anybody, you know, but if nobody's seen 5 and 10, it's a little treat, you know, sometimes we got our dinner there and we're watching bears.
Well, Mondays 5 and 10 will be coming from Valley City, North Dakota.
Okay. Quick question. So the spot where the amphitheater or
Yes.
possible amphitheater, I just kind of was wondering, what have the acoustics been tested there? What are the acoustics like? You know,
No.
I'm just sitting there thinking.
Don't know. As far as I know, nobody, and to give credit where it's due, again, Doug Van Dorn is the one who suggested that might have been the spot for the feeding of the 5,000. We were there, and you can hear the Jordan kind of flowing by. It's a very peaceful sound. None of us was inclined to climb down that hill. I've noticed that the rocks have gotten a lot more wobbly since we were there in 2019. I think they've loosened them. It's surely not that I'm now 62 years old and my legs are getting shaky. But we didn't go down there to check. But that would be a very interesting thing to do. And maybe we'll do that when we go back next time. Because Aaron Lipkin, who runs the tour company that we use, is an archaeology nerd like we are. And so when we said, Aaron, can I bring my drone? Yes, please! To get to that site, we had to go through a closed gate with a sign on it in Hebrew. And we were using Google Maps to follow. It looks like there's a trail that goes back this way. I think we can get there. Aaron, what's that sign say? He's got maybe it's an Israeli thing, wicked sense of humor. It says tourists will be shot. What? He said, no. He says, cattle property, please close gate. Okay. So we drove back in there, we found it, and found out that we could have gotten there easier if we'd gone in through the park that's accessible from the main highway and walked about 900 feet instead of driving in on the cattle path. But we will probably go back early the next time we go to Israel and do more. He's also going to try to get us on that, other firing range when they're not shooting to look at that other megalithic site.
Just one more thing. So next time, sometime when you're looking at that drone footage, it really struck me. So you're looking at the serpent. Obviously, it's a serpent. Off in the background, there is clear evidence of the worldwide flood. You can see, if you ever see this, maybe not so much in that, which clip was it? But anyway.
Okay, because the serpent is not really close to that site overlooking the Jordan River.
Okay.
Yeah, these are about 10 miles east of the Sea of Galilee.
But I saw it, it's kind of a close-up, you can kind of see into the background. I don't know exactly where it was at. But if you ever seen the seashore, the sand after the water goes out and it leaves those big ripples,
Mm-hmm.
you can look out over the terrain and you can see huge ripples from the evidence of the flood.
Is this the one you're talking about?
What's that one?
This is the one overlooking the Jordan. Some of these, by the way, this was part of the outer wall that, because of the earthquakes that hit that area fairly frequently, and quite frankly, they're overdue for a major quake. This kind of fell away from what was the outer wall of the site.
The vegetation covers up a lot of it there. But
It does.
one shot, I told you, you know what I'm talking about.
Well, again, the amazing thing is that this is just 2 miles from the Sea of Galilee. There's a park called the Jordan River Park, about 900 feet this way as you walk. And none of the Israelis know it's there. Most Israelis don't know that Gilgal Rephaim is there. According to the official story, Gilgal Rephaim was only discovered in 1967 after the Israeli army took the Golan Heights away from Syria. It's like, you can see that thing from space. Nobody knew it was there. I mean, the other interesting thing about that serpent mount, that serpent ridge, is that on the two ends, people have looked at that and said, is that like the head and the tail? Like, no, that was essentially a tank emplacement that the Syrians used in 1967. So, yeah, it's. We actually went there and looked at it. There's still like a bunker that you can go down inside. Bats in there. We didn't go in. But Dr. Friedman actually excavated this one here. This is about 20 feet high. And this ridge itself is about 20 feet off the ground. What's hilarious is that when we were here in 2018 and 2019, or 2019 was the first time we went to Gilgal Rephaim, we drove on this road to get over to the site. We were all looking to the right as we were coming towards the site. We totally missed this 3/4 mile long serpent-shaped ridge covered with megalithic burials. We were literally a stone's throw away. Could have thrown a stone out of the side of the Jeep and hit the side of this ridge, and we were all looking in the other direction. It wasn't until we got back home and looked at it on Google Earth. It's like, Sharon, what does that look like to you? It looks like a serpent. Okay, just making sure I wasn't seeing something here. But I thought, surely somebody has excavated this, or it turned out Dr. Friedman, our Russian Jewish biker archaeologist, is the only one who's excavated there within the last 50 years. There have been a couple of other, like when they did the first surveys, the archaeological surveys of the Golan Heights after 1967, a well-known Israeli archaeologist named Claire Epstein went through there, and she dated this stuff to the Middle Bronze Age. Mike Freakman is a contrarian. He says the evidence doesn't point to the Middle Bronze. He puts it back in the Copper Age, which again is sometime prior to about 3500 BC, using their official dates, which I recognize are not consistent with a biblical chronology. We actually address that in a documentary film Skywatch TV has put out called Void Earth. There's a physicist by the name of Barry Setterfield who, boy, this is mind-bending and I'm probably going to forget some of it. Long story short, the speed of light is not a constant. It's slowing down. So what happened a long time ago, which appears to have taken thousands and thousands of years, may actually have happened in terms of solar time in a few days. He estimates, if his calculations are correct, and again, I got a C- in freshman physics in college, so I'm not the guy to explain this. He believes in the first 4 days of creation experienced the equivalent of something like 6 billion years of time. So anyway, so when we say, is it a young Earth or an old Earth? Yes. Yes, ma'am.
As the archaeologist there, does he have any thoughts of how these sites are connected to like other sites, time-wise, culture-wise?
That's one of his areas of interest, actually, on his website.
Gobekli Tepe? Anybody know?
Well, Gobekli Tepe was probably about 5,000 or 6,000 years prior to this, again, according to the timing that they use. But what is interesting is the similarity in the way Gobekli Tepe was ritually buried, and this site on the back of the Serpent Ridge, this little dwelling here, had been ritually buried in the same way. So there are other locations like that where that same thing has been done. In fact, the site of Joshua's altar near the town of Nablus, Shechem, was also buried when the Israelites moved on from there to, where did they go after that? They went through Shiloh. The altar was buried. Joshua's altar was buried. And they found it, they had to excavate it. So this is not an unusual thing. Why they did it, though, we don't really know. Now, in the case of Joshua and the Israelites, it's so that the Canaanites wouldn't come and slaughter unclean animals. They dismantled it and they buried it. But time-wise, I don't know. We've actually been talking with a tour company in Turkey about going to visit Gobekli Tepe. It's just that we figure, look, if we're over in Israel, from Tel Aviv to Ankara, that's a close flight, except that right now getting into Turkey from Israel is problematic. They don't want El Al flights coming in, and if you've got Israel on your passport, that might be a bad thing too, so we're kind of holding off on that. Yes, sir.
Do you give your friends in Israel, if they ever talk about anything they've ever found the Ark, or they have ideas about the Ark, or the get it at their temple?
Yeah, if we talked with our friends about in Israel about the finding of the Ark, not in Israel, but a friend of ours named Aaron Judkins was part of a team with Dr. Randall Price, and Randall Price was also part of the team that found the most recent scroll cave at Qumran. They did a documentary a few years ago called Finding Noah, and didn't come to any definite conclusions, but they did find some organic material where they were looking in Turkey that they were having tested. Now, I've not heard the results of that testing, so don't know. A lot of great archaeology, though, in Israel. I mean, they have found at the site of Mount Ebal, which is where Joshua's altar is located. You heard about the lead curse tablet that they found there? Yeah, showing that there was a written Hebrew language centuries before the critics, the official consensus was, which was, there was no written Hebrew until after the return from Babylon. Okay, except you got this from the 13th century BC. And going back even farther, a friend of ours named Doug Petrovich, Dr. Doug Petrovich, who's written a fascinating book, The Origins of the Hebrews. It's kind of a dense read, but he does a good job of summarizing it, and then he's got the dense stuff where if you want to really dig in as a scholar, you can read his argument that written Hebrew is the world's oldest language. Not only that, he believes it was developed in Egypt by the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. He also has published a paper, and I interviewed him about this last year, on a little broken piece of pottery that's called the Lachish milk bowl ostracon. Now, an ostracon is just a broken piece of pottery. The milk bowl, because it's a unique type of pottery that was used to carry milk around, and on it is some written Hebrew. Apparently, it was carried by somebody with a Hebrew name who, and I forget what the inscription is, but I think he was the one who was in charge of keeping the honey. But it was found at a point in the wall of the ancient city of Lachish, which is southwest of Jerusalem. And they've dated that section of the breach in the wall to the late 15th century BC, which means sometime around 1400 BC, which is just when Joshua and the Israelites went into the land and they defeated a coalition of Amorite kings led by the king of Jerusalem, Adonizedek. The king of Lachish was one of those. And apparently at that time they broke through the walls and burned the city of Lachish. And this guy, carrying this essentially like a little ceramic business card, dropped it in the entry. Now, a lot of scholars are like, oh yeah, that's just too spectacular to be real. Well, they said the same thing about the lead curse tablet. But Doug's a very careful scholar, and his argument is more evidence that there was a written Hebrew language in the time of Moses and Joshua. So yes, Moses could well have written the first 5 books of the Bible, just as we've been told. And here you've got evidence. The scholars don't like to hear that. Even Israeli scholars don't like to hear this. Doug was digging at a town in that area north of the Sea of Galilee near ancient Lake Hula, a town called Hatzor, which was a very powerful city-state in the ancient Canaanite, among the ancient Canaanite kingdoms. Doug was part of a dig at Hatzor led by an Israeli archaeologist. And then he went home, during the off season, and he got a peer-reviewed paper published where he argued that the evidence that they'd found at Hatzor was consistent with the biblical account of Joshua and the Israelites in their northern campaign, destroying the city of Hatzor. Doug did not get invited back by the Israeli scholar leading the dig for the following season, because some of these guys don't want the evidence to show that the biblical history is true. But it is, and the more that they find, the more they're showing that the biblical account is real, which I think is really exciting. This is why Sharon and I look at stuff like this. Yeah, this isn't in the Bible per se, but it's more evidence that there was an ancient cult of the dead around Israel. There are texts from the Amorite kingdoms around ancient Israel that point to that region around the Sea of Galilee. There's an epic called the Epic of Akkad, A-Q-H-A-T, where this young man named Akkad, the son of the king, whose name is Daniel, I guess it was a popular name back in the day, was he was given a magic bow by one of the Canaanite gods, Kothar Wa-Hesis, which means deft and clever or something like that. Sort of like Vulcan or Hephaestus in the Greek and Roman myths, the craftsman god. And the war goddess, Anat, decides she wants this bow, and she demands that he give it to him. Promises even to make him immortal. And the young man laughs at her, said, you can't even do that, and besides, you're a girl. Now, here's a pro tip. Boys, don't make fun of the war goddess who's wearing a belt made of human skulls. That's a bad idea. So she has him killed, and the father goes looking for him. And he says, when I find him, I will mourn, and I will bury him in a tomb for the underworld gods. This was a phrase in the Canaanite stories, the Elohim Eretz, gods of the earth, gods of the underworld, that referred to the Rephaim. So finally, after 3 times, he finds his son, and there are some other geographic clues that put it in the region of the Sea of Galilee. But when he finds his son, I will mourn and I will bury him in a tomb at Kinneret. That is the Hebrew name of the Sea of Galilee. So again, that region around the Sea of Galilee was known to be connected to the Rephaim, the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood, who were venerated by the Canaanite neighbors of the Israelites. Something about that region was supernaturally charged. And when you look at the ancient region of Bashan and see all of these monuments to the dead, and this giant 3/4 of a mile serpent right in the middle of a land called Bashan, i.e. place of the serpent, I mean, did we discover the reason it's called that? I don't know. But it all fits together. There was a cult that venerated these demonic spirits. Jesus based his ministry in this region. And again, not only do we think he was baptized there, the clues in the Gospel of John put it north of the Sea of Galilee at the Jordan River, Bashan, across the Jordan, the region where you see all of those clusters of dolmens. Jesus was saying, hey, yeah, this does matter. He could have said, hey, look, all of this stuff that the pagans are doing is just make-believe. It's all fake. None of this is real. But he didn't do that. He marched his guys on a 30-hour hike there and back, basically, so he could do it at a place that was known to be the entrance to the netherworld, the gates of hell. So if Jesus thought it was important, maybe we should pay attention. This is a real battle. Explains a lot about the state of the world today. Yes, sir.
Do you think this supernatural worldview of the Bible is further growing? Do you think that's why some of the pushback is coming now?
I think so, yeah. I think so. I know that there have been some people who've posted videos critical of Dr. Michael Heiser, and we put together a couple of response videos. But yes, I think you're right. People are saying it's not.
I want you to tell Doug he needs to let you have the last word.
Doug's a good man. We love him. Thank you very much.
And don't forget to go by the auction table and read your bid.
So in relation to his comment,
Yes.
the United Nations, I'm thinking, you said that UNESCO is saying this is the place, don't look up here, look here.
Yeah.
Is it that kind of a?
I don't know that that UNESCO, that the people who designated the site near Jordan or near Jericho as the baptismal site were deliberately trying to mislead people. Maybe there are spirits whispering to them behind the scenes, but I don't know. I don't know if they're smart enough to it. Maybe they're just looking at a site and saying, hey, this is where everybody says it is. Let's help King Abdullah make some money. And I don't begrudge the Jordanians that we've been to Jordan 3 times as part of our Israel tours. And the people of Jordan, again, majority Muslim country, but they're very, very friendly. I would say, especially on our last tour, we got better service in the Jordanian hotels than we did in the Israeli hotels. But they're very proud of their fact that it's biblical history. They're a more moderate form of Muslim than what you find in many other Arab nations. And Jordan doesn't have much in the way of natural resources. Basically, Jordan's natural resources are sand and rocks, which is why one of their main exports is cement. But a lot of the Bible's history takes place in the Jordan Valley and especially east of the Jordan. I'm hoping that the site across from Jericho called Tal El Hammam is developed into a tourist site, because our friends at Trinity Southwest University have conclusively, in my view, shown that that was the site of ancient Sodom. Yeah. I mean, north and east of the Dead Sea is about 8 miles from the Dead Sea, and they found at that location a city that was 85 acres inside the city walls when it was destroyed, at a time when Jerusalem was 12 acres and Jericho was 10 acres. This was the biggest city in the southern Levant, south of Hatzor, which again is that area north of the Sea of Galilee. And when they found the destruction layer, they found that all the bricks, instead of being shaken in all directions like an earthquake would do, they were all blown in one direction from southwest to northeast. Based on the distance some of the bricks traveled, they estimated the speed of the wind blast at about 725 miles per hour. Most powerful F1 tornado or F5 tornado ever recorded is like 250 miles per hour. They also found little fragments of pottery that were flash glazed on one side. Bearing in mind that glazing pottery didn't come to that area until about 600 BC. This was destroyed about 1100 years earlier. 5 millimeters thick, top millimeter glazed, next 2 millimeters burned, the inside 2 millimeters not touched. Something very, very hot, very, very brief. And they found whatever bones they found that were all disarticulated, meaning the humans who got caught in the blast were literally blown apart. They've been doing DNA testing. I've not seen the results of that yet. But the architecture and some of the pottery that they found there, some of the pottery fragments, appear to be Minoan, which is the Proto-Greek culture from the middle of from the island of Cyprus, or Crete. Crete, I think. Anyway, yeah. So they've got something very interesting there as well. And so I don't begrudge the country of Jordan from trying to develop a baptismal site, but I think the actual location north of the Sea of Galilee makes a lot more sense. Disciples call, and John is very specific. John the Baptizer sees Jesus. The next day, his disciple Andrew sees him and runs home to, So.
Wasn't there something about the salts that were embedded in that?
The destruction layer at Sodom, we become friends with the director of scientific analysis there, Dr. Name is Philip. It'll come to me probably about 2 in the morning. Anyway, Philip Sylvia. He said that when he was there and he was working on his doctoral dissertation, he noticed as they got to the site in the morning, there was this white crystalline substance that had formed on the destruction layer, was leaching to the surface. And so they took samples of it and they sent it off for testing. Now, bearing in mind, this is 8 miles away from the Dead Sea, and 75 feet above the Jordan Valley. The chemical composition, the sulfates, the salt, matched exactly the Dead Sea. So 8 miles away. They theorize it was an explosion similar to what happened at Tunguska back in, was it 1911? Something that exploded in the air. And like the nuclear tests in the South Pacific, it sucked the water up and then sprayed it across the southern Jordan Valley. They did soil samples down in the valley. They found that the soil was so poisoned by the salt, it's 36% salt content, it's the saltiest water on earth, that you couldn't grow anything there for like 700 years after the event, down to the time of David and Solomon, except for acacia, because acacia is drought and salt tolerant. And when Moses and the Israelites got there in 1400 BC, they called it Avel Shittim, which means the acacias of mourning, or the meadow of acacias, because that's all that would grow there. So again, biblical history confirmed.
And it wasn't like a meteor that hit the water? It was something blew up?
They believe that it exploded in the air, because they didn't find evidence of a direct strike, like a crater.
Oh, okay.
But they found what they call shocked quartz and other things. They published a paper in Nature, a peer-reviewed journal, in September of 22. And they didn't mention the Bible specifically. They just said, destroyed a Middle Bronze Age city in the southern Levant. But people picked up on it pretty quickly and immediately started critiquing it. You got skeptics saying they're just Christians trying to prove the Bible. You get Christians saying, it doesn't fit my timeline because Abraham lived 400 years before. So, but look, you've got an area that is visible from Bethel, which is where Lot looked up, which is a euphemism in the ancient world, meaning he looked to the east and saw that the plain was well watered, the valley was well watered. You can see Tal el Hammam from Bethel. The traditional site, which is southeast of the Dead Sea, is not visible from Bethel. It was destroyed at about the right period of time. The type of destruction fits, and there's no evidence that that city, I mean, the city walls of Sodom were immense. It was never conquered militarily. So this was not an explosion, even if they'd had gunpowder in the 17th, 18th century BC, which they didn't. That's not what caused it. Something blew up very hot, very intense, and the destruction is consistent with what little evidence they've been able to find from Tunguska. But there was that Chelyabinsk back in, was it 2006? Exploded over Russia, blew out a bunch of windows, sent a bunch of people to hospital. It was not nearly as big, thankfully. But yeah, again, it's interesting. And we speculate, in fact, in our forthcoming book, The Gates of Hell, that the reason God did that was not because of the lifestyle of the people of Sodom. I mean, sodomite has become a synonym for a certain lifestyle, but that's been practiced all over the world in many cultures. I mean, well, but the Israelites, when they camped there under Moses at Avel Shittim, Israeli archaeologist named Nelson Glick back in the 1940s speculated that Avel Shittim was actually on the Tal, even though they hadn't excavated there and found the destruction. They knew about the Tel, the ruined mound there, thought that that's where Moses and the Israelites had camped, up on the hill overlooking the valley. And that's where they were drawn into the worship of a god called Baal Peor, or Baal Peor. Peor derives from a Hebrew word that means opening or cleft or gap. And when you read in Psalm 106, verse 28, what made God so angry about that worship, that he sent a plague that killed 24,000 Israelites before Phinehas got stabby, basically speared an Israelite prince and a Midianite princess who were apparently engaged in some sort of fertility rite in the sight of Moses and all Israel. It was the fact that the Israelites, according to the psalmist, were eating sacrifices offered to the dead. So we argue in The Gates of Hell that Baal Peor, Lord of the opening, or Lord of the gates of hell, opening, cleft, gap, that was who was being worshipped there at Sodom. And again, it's speculative because they've not found the palace archives. They were hoping to do this last year, which was their last season of digging there. The Jordanian government has basically said, nope, you're done. They were hoping that the palace archives might have survived. They found the palace. They found what they believe was the temple precinct, or the sacred area. And at the base of the city, Dr. Stephen Collins, who's been leading the excavations there since 2005, wrote in his book about the discovery of Sodom. They found at the base of the Tal, base of the hill, 1,500 dolmens. More dolmens clustered at the base of that hill than anywhere else in the Jordan Valley. More dolmens clustered tighter together there than anywhere else on the Golan Heights. So I asked Dr. Sylvia when I interviewed him a couple of years ago, how were these aligned? Were they aligned to the stars? I mean, summer solstice, the rising of the constellation Orion, whatever. I said, no, they were all oriented toward what we think was the temple. Like, oh. They did find one dolmen. Most of the dolmens have been robbed out throughout history because they've been there for 5,000, 6,000 years. I mean, if you're looking to make a quick buck, in Jordan, the archaeologists refer to these guys as night diggers. They follow the archaeologists around. Hey, they're digging at a new site over there. Let's go there tonight and see what they found, because maybe they can get some artifacts and sell them in the black market. There was a dolmen they found at the base of Sodom that hadn't been touched because it was kind of hidden where it was located. They found one that had not been robbed. They didn't find any human remains in there, but they found, like, maybe, except for like a bone here or a bone there, but they found pottery, they found jewelry, they found things like that. And apparently it had been in use consistently, they believe, based on the types of pottery they found in there, since roughly 4000 BC, which was about the time the city was founded, until its destruction in 1700 BC. 2,300 years used. They believe that the dolmens, at least in that part of the Jordan Valley, were used for what they call a sky burial. Your relative dies, you put him out on top of the dolmen, the birds pick the bones clean, and then you bury him in a shaft grave. But then once a year, you have a ritual where you come and you do something at the dolmen where you put in a pot or jewelry or whatever, and you just keep pushing stuff in from the front to the back. So they're still analyzing that find, which was like 5 or 6 years ago. So I'm sad that they are not able to go back, but they've got a lot of, Dr. Collins is 70 now. He's going to be publishing papers until he dies on that site and getting a lot of criticism. But we think that site, because of the number of dolmens clustered at the base of the city, the fact that the Israelites were drawn into a cult where they were eating sacrifices offered to the dead, the fact that two of the stops, the two last stops on the Exodus trail before they camped at Avel Shittim, one called Ovoth, which literally means spirits of the dead, and another called Ai HaAvarim, which means ruins of the travelers. That's the last stop before they camped. Avarim is a term that was used by the Canaanites to describe the spirits of the Rephaim, in the sense that the word translated as travelers, in the sense that they traveled or crossed over from the spirit realm to the realm of the living. There's 3 texts that have been found at a site called Ugarit, the ancient Amorite kingdom of Ugarit, which is on the Syrian coast. It's on the Mediterranean Sea, found about 1922. And scholars are still arguing over the interpretation because the texts, the clay tablets, weren't all in good shape. But 3 of them have been dubbed the Rephaim texts because they deal with the Rephaim. And in one of them, the Rephaim are summoned to a ritual meal at the tabernacle of El, or the sanctuary of El, or the threshing floor of El. And in the ancient world, and we go into this in the Gates of Hell, threshing floors were believed to be points of contact between this realm and the next. Where did David confront the angel of the Lord who was destroying Israel because he had conducted a census? The threshing floor of Arana, which is where then Solomon built the temple. The threshing floor of El was the summit of Mount Hermon. And in this text, the Rephaim, the travelers, are described as mounting their chariots, where they traveled first one day and then another, and they arrived at the tabernacle of El at dawn of the 3rd day. As a Christian, that should make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, because this text dates to about 1200 BC, 1200 years before Jesus. These demonic spirits of the Rephaim were summoned to the summit, where it was believed, according to the text, that the blessing of the name of El, their father God, would revivify or resurrect the heroes. So Jesus goes to Mount Hermon 1200 years later and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And then he climbs the mountain for the transfiguration. I know, yeah, I probably should have put that in the text, in the talk. But it all fits together, and there's just so much. I mean, you could do 6 hours on this stuff and still not cover it all. But yeah.
Say enough how much I think everybody appreciates your ability to articulate this stuff. And then you have some visual aids, and it's really been wonderful.
Well, again, we owe a debt of gratitude to Aaron Lipkin of Lipkin Tours, who is so willing to share this drone footage. Where instead of making his own DVDs and selling it, he said, "Here, take this, use it." Yeah. And so.
Is he still stuck in that little
Aaron,
isolated area?
he and his family live in what the world calls the West Bank. They live in Samaria. And he said for them, life's not all that different because Hezbollah and Hamas don't want to shoot rockets into areas where they might hit Arab villages. So they've got a lot of Arab villages around them. The fact that his mother is an Egyptian Jew and speaks Arabic, which he speaks, he's become very important to the IDF. So, yeah, He served his 90 days in the reserves, and then they kept him, and he's 49, so he's not at peak fighting age, but he's working in intelligence now. Because Evyatar is also serving, yep, one of their daughters is also serving. And again, Dr. Freakman, again, they're calling up archaeologists. When we were there back in the spring, life was going on as normal in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Other than you saw the signs blaming Netanyahu for everything. A lot of those signs, we believe, are being funded by Western NGOs. But people were living their lives. What was remarkable is when we were staying at the hotel in Jerusalem, unlike our previous trips where we were surrounded by tourists, tourists from Africa, tourists from China, other tourists from Europe, North America, all of the other people in the hotel we were in back in May were refugees who'd been kicked out of the north because their homes were getting under threat of being hit by Hezbollah rockets. Hotel manager, they apologized to us. We're sorry, the children, they make such noise. Like, no, it's wonderful. We need more kids in America. So we did see some of the villages. We saw that Nova Music Festival that had been attacked last October. And it's been turned into a memorial for 364 who were killed, 240 were captured, 200 of them from that music festival. We visited a village called Ofakim, and we were there, 7 months after the event, and the homes still had bullet holes going up the walls. We saw one home. We'd heard about this woman's story. We watch I-24 News out of Israel. So it's got English language programming. And a woman who's become sort of a folk hero in Israel by the name of Rachel Edrei. And we didn't realize we were going to see her house when we got there. The neighbors were out there. The people from all over Israel coming to this little village, on like a mile and a half from the border with Gaza. On October 7th, terrorists, and one of the neighbors showed us security camera footage from their security camera over their front door. They shot the Edrei's family dog. It was in the front yard. It was trying to get away. It was terrified because the gunfire was everywhere, and they shot the dog. It was not like a Doberman or a German Shepherd. It was a little dog. And they broke into the house. Rachel Edrei and her husband David were there. And this woman, she's in her 60s. She runs the canteen at an IDF base in the Negev. And she speaks Arabic. So they break in. She's thinking, she says, "You boys look hungry. Can I fix you something to eat? Would you like some coffee?" They're like, okay. And so she starts feeding them and engaging them, telling them stories. "You want some cookies? I've got some cookies. I can bake some bread. How about some baklava?" Whatever. She's stalling them. And these guys who minutes earlier had been out there shooting their neighbors, she stalls them. Now, the Edrei's son was a member of the local police force. And he realizes, mom, dad aren't answering the phone, something's going on. He comes to the house, she sees him out the kitchen window and doesn't give him away, but she holds up 5 fingers. There are 5 of them in the house. So the son gets some counterterrorism troops who are trying to clear the area of the terrorists. Meanwhile, this woman's fed these guys, some of them, they're taking naps. She stalls these guys for 20 hours by feeding. 20 hours, she's got these murderous terrorists in her home. She's feeding them, she's keeping them distracted, she's telling them stories, whatever. Meanwhile, her son's outside giving intel on the house to the counter-terrorist guys. Go in through the front door, take a right, whatever. They go in, neutralize the terrorists. 20 hours. And it didn't dawn on me until afterward. We met the neighbors. The neighbors are saying, "Look, the paint business that we worked for, it's been destroyed. It was damaged in the fight. We haven't been able to work since then. The government has not sent us any relief. Apparently, the Israeli government is even less efficient than the American government." We passed a hat, took up a collection. the neighbors that we were meeting and talking to that day. It didn't dawn us until later how many of them would not have been there if this woman had not been thinking quickly and stalled them. Joe Biden met with her. The UK's foreign minister, James Cleverly, met with her. This woman has got murals with her face on it in Tel Aviv and in Haifa. And so, we were blessed to see that. We were hoping to go back in November, but I think the threat of war is such, we just have not been able to get people to sign up. But we look forward to the day we can go back, because there is something about going to that land and seeing these battlegrounds, seeing the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives, well, I could go on. Why did Jesus spend so much time there the last week of his life? There are reasons for these things. That's what Sharon and I love to study. And so we feel blessed to do what we do. So when we get an opportunity, and thank you, Wyatt, for letting me just go on and blather like this, to share this, the fact that the Bible isn't boring. If we think it's boring, it's only because most of us have been taught that most of the characters in it are fictional. That's why we titled our last book that Sharon and I wrote, Giants, Gods, and Dragons. There was a story that came out that the players of the game Dungeons and Dragons, you heard of that? Yeah. That they were upset at the way the orcs were depicted. The orcs are like these really, evil, twisted creatures that in the world of J.R.R. Tolkien had been elves at one point, but they had been twisted. They were inherently evil. There was nothing good or redeeming about the orcs. They lived for bloodshed, and you would not want to have orcs as neighbors. Let's just put it that way. But players of the game had gotten angry because the orcs, who are usually depicted as having, green skin or dark skin, whatever, their skin has color to it, whereas the elves are fair-skinned and blonde, and it's racist. Okay, so the company that makes the game, Wizards of the Coast, said, all right, we'll change the game so you can play the orcs as good characters if you want to. And Amazon now, with its new Rings of Power series, is now depicting the orcs as sympathetic. Oh, look, here's the orc daddy telling the orc leader that he doesn't want to go to war because he's got orc mommy and orc kitties. This is not how Tolkien wrote the story. But we can laugh at them and say they're treating these fictional characters as though they're real and actually protesting based on it. And yet, according to survey after survey, we Christians who are given the Word of God that says that these things called giants, God, who in the Bible calls these things gods, and dragons, we're treating them as though they're fiction. So D&D players treating fictional characters like they're real, but we're treating the Word of God like it's fiction. You want to get kids excited about the Bible, read Job 41. The description of Leviathan. Oh, it sneezes forth flame. It's got shields of armor on its back. Well, that sounds like a dragon to me. But no, Bible commentators say, no, it's a crocodile. No, the Bible is exciting. It's the Lord of the Rings on steroids. And what's really exciting about it is that we're in it. And that's why we do what we do.
And you do know it became off as a hippopotamus, right?
Yeah, with a tail like a cedar.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I don't think so.
I was just going to say, a couple of weeks ago, I went on a dinosaur dig over in Glendive, Montana. They have an awesome museum over there. And anyway, I went on a